Got some familiar faces in the audience, which is always lovely. I'm Caroline Bruni. I am a lived experience survivor advocate, an author, and a survivor life coach. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet here today and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I would like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge the victim survivors in the room. I am mindful that there are many people with lived experience here at this conference, so I am one of you and I appreciate the work that you do. In addition to that, I am feeling conference fatigue on day 3. So, against all rules to the event organisers, if you need to sit on the floor or stand up or wiggle around or fidget, please do, because that's probably what I'm going to need to do for the rest of the day to get through the day. Lastly, I have 2 copies of my memoir that I will be giving away to anyone who, well, the first 2 people that ask questions or share some insights. If you would like a copy, I'm not going to force one on you, but keep that in mind if you are planning to ask a question. So, the recent Australian Child Maltreatment Study, published in April of 2023, has highlighted and confirmed data that many of us have suspected for quite some time. We have learnt that 28.5% of Australians have been subjected to child sexual abuse, and that when a child is subjected to child sexual abuse, they are often re-exposed to the abuse, with 78% of children being subjected to abuse more than once. In addition to this data, we are now aware that 2 in 5 Australians have been subjected to 2 or more types of maltreatment, consisting of physical, sexual and emotional abuse, neglect or exposure to family violence. We have seen that this lived experience causes health risk behaviours such as, with victim survivors likely being dependent on drugs and alcohol, as well as being more likely to self-harm, attempt suicide or display other significant health concerns. This co-occurrence, especially in childhood, has also been shown to set the foundation for re-victimisation. Victim survivors are more likely to go on to experience family, domestic and intimate partner violence in their teen and adult relationships. Though health risk behaviours such as drug and alcohol abuse and ill mental health concerns are somewhat obvious and likely to be discussed throughout the support often offered to victim survivors during their childhood and as ongoing discussions throughout their lives, there is a blind spot when it comes to the knowledge and awareness around re-victimisation within the victim survivor community. Victim survivors are often heavily focused on surviving the abuse itself, and as they move from childhood to adulthood, are faced with navigating the psychological, economic, and potential legal minefield after the end of the abuse. In addition to this minefield, there is a deep cloud of shame, which silences victim survivors in gaining a deeper understanding of why what happened to them as a child may have played a significant factor in their relationships as an adult. Today, as a lived experience survivor advocate, I can see that I had that exact blind spot. As a child and a teenager, my instincts made me aware that I was in danger as I was subjected to child sexual abuse, incest and trauma. What I had not realised at the time of this abuse is that I was also living in a home shaped by domestic violence, with coercive control playing a major role in my nuclear family for years to come. This mix of child sexual abuse, incest, violence and control played out endlessly behind the scenes and behind the facade of our happy family. To the public eye, my parents were in a loving marriage. I was the perfect daughter to my abusive father, and my siblings were the picture-perfect addition to our story. Upon reflection, I can see that control had played a foundational role in our family way before I was born. Looking at my mother's behaviour and the dynamic of my parents' relationship, my father had mastered his balance of power and control, early in their relationship. I don't know if he violently harmed my mother in the early stages of their relationship, but as a child, witnessing the outbursts of anger, the yelling, the throwing of items, the slamming of doors, or worse, the cold shoulder and silent treatment meant that I was terrified of my father. This terror was the groundwork of his grooming, which meant that when I was 10 and he began to sexually abuse me, there wasn't a major shift in my behaviour. I had already become accustomed to being subjected to the behaviour that I knew was wrong. His grooming had likely begun in my infancy, and due to this type of control, the sexual abuse I was subjected to continued for 4 years. Similar to the men discussed in the recent findings from the University of New South Wales and the other contributing organisations, my father was hiding in plain sight. He was married, earning a suitable income, and was an active member of the community, and his secretive and abusive behaviour was hidden from people closest to us. Years later, at the age of 16, I disclosed the sexual abuse to my mother. I can confirm that she believed me, but heartbreakingly, she did not have the capacity to leave him. The foundations of his control and decades of being subjected to the dominant power dynamic saw her not only stay in the relationship, but request that myself and my siblings remain in our family home to continue to play our roles as a happy family. The institution of family, its hierarchy and power structures were further forged, and it was clear that my health and well-being would be sacrificed to maintain this institution and its reputation publicly. From that moment, devastated by my mother's choice not to do more, I turned inward and focused solely on surviving and healing from the child sexual abuse and protecting my younger sister, whilst balancing my existence living in the toxic environment of our family institution. I will add that I was offered minor support from my mother in the form of a few brief appointments with a psychologist. Similar to the data I discussed earlier, the focus of these sessions was to ensure that I did not self-harm, attempt suicide, or abuse drugs or alcohol. Upon reflection, during those sessions, even though I was a teenager and beginning to explore relationships with boys and men, not much was said about how the abuse I was subjected to may impact future relationships or decisions that may see me enter into further abusive environments. Over the next few years, I would have various relationships that were both harmful physically and psychologically. In many of those relationships, my partners would be years older than me, skewing the power dynamic and in many ways replaying the abuse structure of my childhood. Looking back, it is clear, due to the grooming I was subjected to as a child, I was already subconsciously conditioned to be a victim of coercive control and domestic violence. When we look at the stages of grooming described in 2016 by Georgia Winters and Elizabeth Jellick, we note that grooming involves targeting, gaining trust, filling a need, isolation, normalising behaviour, and then maintaining control. All of these were elements I was subjected to from my infancy. When I compare the stages of grooming to the stages of coercive control, establishing trust, isolation, blaming, gaslighting, enforcement of trivial demands, relentless monitoring, alternating punishments with rewards, threats and degradation, I am not surprised that these traits in my partners did not alarm me. I was conditioned from birth to accept this behaviour, and though internally my instincts and the trauma responses they created were screaming at me that something was wrong and that I was unsafe, in many ways I just didn't know any better. This is by far the most dangerous element of the abuse that occurs within the institution of family. The grooming and coercion that sets the foundation and almost welcomes ongoing abuse from that point on. As a 15-year-old, I had a relationship with a 24-year-old man. This relationship exposed me to violence, drug and alcohol abuse, and criminal behaviour by this man and his network of friends. Once I turned 16, almost to the day, the relationship escalated to us having sex, and in the months to come, he ended the relationship. At the time, I saw this as heartbreak and betrayal. But now, upon reflection, I can see this behaviour as predatory, manipulative, and controlling. As a young adult, I met a man who was 12 years older than me, and our relationship accelerated at a toxic speed. Love bombing and obsessive behaviour I renamed as romance and love. Initially, this relationship was a long-distance one as we had met through work, so I was bombarded with gifts and endless phone calls and emails. I reciprocated this avalanche of communication, believing it was how love had to be shown. This meant that I became distracted and began to distance myself from friends and family. Soon into the relationship, there was an opportunity for this man to move overseas for work, and he invited me to move with him. So there I was, a 19-year-old young woman, now worlds away from my family and friends and solely dependent on this man. Within the first week of my time overseas, we had an explosive argument where he belittled me in public and then proceeded to leave me by myself at night in a place I had never been. I was abandoned with no sense of where I was, not much money to my name, and no idea how I would make it back to his apartment. Luckily, I found some of his work colleagues who helped me find my way, though when I arrived back at the apartment, I had to beg outside the door to be let back in. This was the first time he really showed me who he was, and it became clear that he needed control at any cost. Subconsciously, I had seen this relationship modelling by my own parents, and I knew nothing else, so I complied. I believed that it was the role of a woman in an adult relationship, and if I just tried a little harder, he might just not get as upset with me and we could be happy again. This relationship continued for over 7 years, and throughout the relationship, not only was I subjected to domestic and sexual violence, but my disclosure of the sexual abuse and incest I was subjected to as a child that I had shared with this man early in our relationship was used against me. The perpetrator used my lived experience to undermine my autonomy, manipulate my behaviour, and jeopardise my public reputation by threatening to out me as an incest survivor before I was ready to publicly disclose. Despite this behaviour, I would go on to marry this man. Eventually, I ended the relationship, though the abuse and coercive control did not end. To be honest, it escalated. We now had a child together, which meant that I now had to navigate the family court system whilst raising my son and attempting to protect him from the family violence of his father. Again, when I look at the support I received at this point in time, the support I received at this point in time, the focus was on self-harm, drug and alcohol abuse, and other health concerns. There was little discussion of the likelihood that this relationship could not only set a deeper foundation for re-victimisation in my future relationships, but that this relationship may also have created a blueprint for my son, who had witnessed the relationship modelling and who may now be susceptible to repeating this behaviour in the future. Thank you for the tissues. Thank you. I kind of love when you get to blow your nose on stage. It's so ladylike and eloquent. Oh my goodness. To many of you in this room, the points that I'm raising from my lived experience are not new to you. You are here because you work in this space, and I'm mindful that you choose this work because of your lived experience. Consciously or subconsciously, you know how this story plays out, and as you've either lived a part of this yourself or you know many others who have. It's heartbreaking yet not surprising how much of ourselves we see in the stories of other victim survivors. What I've found to be the most alarming when I speak with other victim survivors, especially those of my generation, and yes, I'm in my 40s, and the generations older than me, is that we have all had this blind spot at some stage in our lives. The warning signs have simply been missed. And when it comes to the care and education we have been received post-trauma or post-disclosure, in some cases, we've been made aware of this and the likelihood of re-victimisation far too late. And we've already entered the cycles subjected to the consequences of this lack of information. I'll be honest, as a teenager in the 90s, I'm conscious that I disclosed and grew up at a time where sex education, discussions around respectful relationships and grooming and consent barely existed. I'm mindful that I would have likely pushed back on warnings and red flags, and that because I was subjected to child sexual abuse, and if someone had told me that that was going to happen in the future, I probably would have just ignored it and probably rebelled against the advice. This was due to the lack of support, education, and overall understanding that I had at the time, and in addition to the shame I was carrying by being abused by my father. But we are not in the 90s anymore, and as a parent of a preteen and a young adult, I believe that we are now in a position where we can not only raise awareness within the youth victim survivor community around the intersection of child sexual abuse and re-victimisation, but we can also empower victim survivors by supporting their autonomy and focusing on their healing, recovery, and ongoing safety to reduce re-victimisation in the future. When researching the current respectful relationships education programs, I was optimistic. It's clear that we are no longer in the 90s, and it's a positive sign that the programs are being delivered to children as young as 12 and educating them on opening discussions on the warning signs of controlling and abusive behaviours in relationships. However, I'm mindful that the victim survivors in those rooms are either still being subjected to child sexual abuse or have been subjected to child sexual abuse, may already be aware of these matters and may find the content really difficult to sit through, as they may find it triggering. Since the release of the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, I understand that many organisations are revisiting their youth programs. It's vital that in addition to these programs, facilitators attend trauma-informed training so they can look for the signs of potential triggers in the youth attending these programs and read between the lines to see the nuances in their behaviour. To learn about these nuances, it is imperative that trauma-informed training is developed with both youth and adult lived experience contributors. We at times can pigeonhole what victim survivors look like, what their triggers are. Most people don't know that I am a victim survivor, as I have lived my life as a high-functioning trauma survivor. As a child or a teenager, if I had sat through some of the programs that exist, I would have masked my triggers. I would have masked them with my high-functioning trauma survivor, people-pleasing perfectionism. I can just do more and I'll just take it on my to-do list. It's the traits that we're rewarded for in society. But if someone had had some trauma-informed training to look for those non-obvious cues, they would have spotted that something was just not quite right. Children and young people are far more powerful than what we give them credit for. They don't want to be told what to do, just like you and I don't want to be dictated to as adults. So, for the young people who have already had their safety, autonomy and respect taken from them, the thought of another adult predicting their future just simply won't work. But I believe with trauma-informed, considered language, we can plant some foundations, lay some seeds, and spark ideas for these young victim survivors. So they can look at a case study or a statement that in the future may highlight a red flag in their relationships. In addition to the amendments to these programs to support the young victim survivors, we must also look at programs to support and educate parents and caregivers about grooming and predatory behaviour, especially in our close family and community networks. We know that perpetrators are more likely to be people known to the victim survivor and their family. This isn't an isolated parent or isolated adult and child situation. The grooming occurs to all of the people around the child. Now, I am mindful that this type of education may not and probably will not dismantle the abuse that occurs within the institution of family. It is another topic for another day, maybe at another conference, maybe at another abstract that I'm open to talking about because it is very complicated. Lastly, as we focus on young victim survivors, their parents and caregivers, we must also develop programs that educate young people, but specifically young boys and men, that may be potential perpetrators. In a similar way that we pigeonhole victim survivors and their behaviour, we are missing the nuance in the behaviour of young perpetrators, the privilege they carry, the language and behaviour they have witnessed or been subjected to, and the conscious or unconscious views they have on how power can be used to control and harm others. We must look for these initial cues so that these potential perpetrators do not go on to cause harm and hide in plain sight. We must develop programs that are trauma-informed to look at their behaviours and plant similar seeds to reduce the escalation of this behaviour. The 10-year-old version of me needed to hear those stories. I genuinely believed at the time that I was the only person in the whole world that was experiencing what I was experiencing. And as I grew up, the teenage version of me needed to know that it was so common for men to be other types of perpetrators, to control and harm me in other ways. That 10-year-old teenager and I want to thank the victim survivors out there who have shared their stories, contributed their lived experience, and made real change. Those stories are by far what have been the most powerful for me as I have begun to heal. For everyone here today, I encourage you, if you haven't already, to find trauma-informed ways to support victim survivors, to find their voice and to share their lived experience. They are already armed with so much strength and resilience. Let's empower them with new tools and insights to help them create a life that is focused on positive cycles of change so that we can end re-victimisation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. That was amazing and courageous. And I know I can speak for everyone in this room when I express that. That was so powerful and really important to hear, and so much practical advice as well. So thank you again. We have some time for a couple of questions, and Caroline's also generously said that she's got 2 copies of her memoir for the first 2 questions. So getting, boom.
Oh, Harry. So cheeky. I might just give Harry one and then save the others for people I don't know, but let's see.
Again, I just want to echo your power, your resilience, your tenacity. Thank you so much for your generosity and courage in sharing your story, Caroline. I see you, I stand with you. My question is, we talk about institutional child sexual abuse a lot, and part of it is because it's sort of easier to point the finger at an institution. And when sexual abuse happens within a family, it really tears the family into two, the I believe her camp or I don't. As one survivor, and this is a very big question, what are some of your ideas into how we can shift the conversation into that child sexual abuse can happen within a family. What are some measures that we can implement into shifting that conversation and saying this does happen under our own roof? Because it's something that hits close to home quite literally, actually, and it's tough to talk about. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you definitely earned the book because that was a really hard question. So the first thing I think we need to start doing is destigmatising the word incest. It's a really icky word, I get it. It's really uncomfortable, but I say it because it makes people uncomfortable and it means that they have to think about what that means, what society, what the media has made that mean, and why that level of uncomfortability is any different to any child being abused. Why it's uncomfortable is because it makes us question the people we love the most, and it makes us choose. So when we put the title of father, mother, sister, brother, so on and so forth, in a hierarchy situation, when we think about power and the hierarchy of the institution of family, that is the strongest power hierarchy that exists for all of us. And it also really challenges our sense of safety. So I think as a society, if we can start breaking the stigma and taboo around this topic, because if we look at the data, it's horrific. And people are not reporting because of the shame. And it's a whole nother level of shame. So that is the first step. Collectively, in this industry, in this sector, we need to start empowering the voices of survivors that are incest survivors, because we just don't get our voices heard, and we're not encouraged to speak because it makes us uncomfortable and it makes everyone else so uncomfortable. In addition to that, I think there need to be some additional resources that look at the nuance of the support that people need that have experienced abuse in the home. We talk about domestic and family violence, and we understand that that happens in the home, but there's often the layer of sexual violence that's happening in the home, and it gets siloed. We put everything under all of these different silos. We need to be collectively looking at the umbrella that we're sitting under and then working together, because in most cases, like even when I shared my lived experience, I can't split myself up against all these silos. I need to be looking at myself as one whole individual. I don't even know if I've answered your question. So I guess the last thing is, and Maddie and Kathy talked about this earlier in regards to peer support. I definitely think that as incest survivors or survivors of family abuse, we need peer support. We need to be hearing from people that understand our lived experience and to understand the nuance of the isolation that we feel. It's nearly Christmas. It's the crappiest time. I went to swear, but I didn't swear. It's such a hard time of the year for us, and people just don't seem to understand. So, yeah, thanks, Harry.
I think we have time for one more question. Yep.
Thank you for your courage and sharing. I just wanted to ask, you've been very brave in naming your father. Mm-hmm. What was... A lot of us victim survivors, and the shame that we carry, we don't name our perpetrators. And I've also been told, you've got to watch out that they don't sue you or all of that. So could I ask, was there any fallout through you naming and being so open about your experience with your perpetrator, your father?
Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind sharing, that would be great.
Yeah, of course. The first thing I want to address is that the shame doesn't belong to me. So I've put it back in the hands of the person it belongs to. And that's the first part. It's the hardest part, and in my case, and it's a very complex story, so I've actually only been speaking about my lived experience for probably about 2 years. And I've only been estranged from my parents for 3. So prior to that, I would have been having Christmas dinner with them. So that in itself is very complex, and it forms a part of the high-functioning trauma survivor that I've been for a very long time. So when I chose to hand that shame back, because it didn't belong to me ever, that was the first part for me. And then all of those years of seeking out ways of being a perfectionism meant that I picked up some pretty good skills on how to empower myself to do the things that I want to do. So the first thing I actually said to my parents is that I'm going to be speaking about this publicly. Now, that is one very small example. I know not everyone has the capacity to do that, but that was my first step, and that I personally chose not to seek the legal route. That wasn't my journey, but I did say that I'm choosing to speak because I do not want this to continue to happen, and I need to start helping other victim survivors to no longer carry the shame that is not theirs. My father has admitted to the abuse. My mother is aware of the abuse. There are multiple people in our family structure that know. It would be really naive of them to go down the route of defamation or anything else. But as I said, that's just my story. I know that not everyone has that situation, and not everyone has that level of being able to just continue down their path. But in my case, I don't think it's luck. I think I've just worked really hard to be where I am. Thanks.
I don't need to say this because everyone's already applauding, but we talk a lot about the importance of embedding lived experience. It's in our national plan, it's in all of our action plans, but none of that is possible unless brave people like Caroline share their story. So I just want to say thank you again, and that was just such an important talk and a real privilege to be here for it, so thank you.
Thank you.